Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the non-signature cards for the Chaos faction that were included within the core set. In this video, I'm only going to discuss and provide an overview of the card combinations and synergy present within the core set itself, although in later videos I'll be reviewing each and every one of this game's released and upcoming war packs and deluxe expansions. Although this video is going to concentrate on card analysis primarily from the perspective of a Chaos player, I'll nevertheless be touching on any synergy with loyal Orcs and Dark Eldar faction cards when appropriate. Because I'm sure to miss some uses for these cards over the course of this video, be sure to mention your personal favorites in the comments below. But with that said, let's get things started with the first of our Chaos army units. First up, we have the Alpha Legion Infiltrator with a cost of 2, 1 command icon, a loyal icon, an attack value of 4, a single hit point, and the Scout and Alpha Legion traits with no game-relevant text. So, my immediate appraisal of this basic army unit is that it's very low cost. It's essentially vanilla, as with so many other units that we've seen, but its attack value is cranked up at the cost of its hit points. It does have a standard 1 command icon, so that if it happens to be deployed to a planet alone, it has the potential of winning command struggles for you, but similar to the Dark Eldar's Incubus Warrior, this rather frail army unit focuses on dealing as much damage as possible before it's eventually destroyed. It only has half the command presence of that Dark Eldar unit, so it's not going to be nearly so valuable in winning command struggles for you, in helping you to command some of that early game card and resource advantage, but particularly if you happen to be the player holding the initiative token, you could potentially get in some devastating hits with this very high attack power army. Particularly considering if the Chaos player is running Zerathur, at his location it's entirely possible that this 2-cost unit could ultimately assign 5 damage per attack, but after the very early game, getting him into combat, let alone letting him get an attack off, might be very difficult, just because he's so extraordinarily vulnerable. Whether it's something like the Orc Cannon's combat action that forces you to assign an indirect damage, that could easily destroy him if he's alone and you're not willing to expend shield cards. Maybe you're up against a Space Marines player playing Sicarius's Chosen, and he uses that win interest play reaction to simply snipe off your Infiltrator. Or maybe he ends up being collateral damage when you yourself or any other player triggers a Warp Storm or any similar effect. Any ranged unit in the game has at least 1 attack value, and many of them have all the more than that. So values like 2 or 3, unless you're really willing to invest heavily in shield cards, it's probably not going to save this unit, and given just how high that attack power could be, unless you're running up against much more expensive, more durable, and resilient enemy units, you're likely to not even need all of the attack power that he can bring to bear. So certainly the Infiltrator here has the potential to be effective. It's possible that he could be devastating in the right situation, particularly when combined with Zerathur's signature event, the Infernal Gateway, so that you can drop him into play by surprise, drop pod style. But definitely during a prolonged combat, he's likely to be killed very early on. It's quite likely that ultimately, those resources you've invested in this unit could easily go to waste. And particularly considering that at the moment those traits have no synergy, and that this unit is just so enormously fragile, unless you really need a tremendous amount of attack power, personally I'd probably be much more comfortable with a little bit more balanced, a little bit hardier basic unit. But in any case, next up we have the very definition of a Death Star unit in the 8-cost Black Legion Helldrake, with 3 command icons, also a loyal icon, an enormous 8 attack value, and a seemingly insurmountable 8 hit points. It has the Demon, Black Legion, and Elite traits, the text no war gear attachments, and to make this already formidable unit all the more difficult to destroy, it also possesses the Flying keyword, whereupon if it ever happens to take damage from an attack, it's ultimately only assigned half of that value in damage. So, quite clearly, this enormously powerful unit is also incredibly expensive, and more so than any other unit in the game, this not only commands the greatest resource investment, but it also has the greatest statistical distribution. And even though the Space Marines Ultramarines Dreadnought army unit matches it point for point when it comes to attack and HP, that flying keyword nevertheless means that from that 6-cost army unit, it's only ultimately going to take 4 damage per attack, and it's entirely possible for this Helldrake to destroy any other unit in the game, so long as shield cards aren't used and there's no event or action or other intervention, in a single swing. Under absolutely optimal conditions, that 8 flying hit points essentially equates to a grand total of 16. And before I move on to the potential pitfalls of this unit, I'll also mention that that fantastic command icon value is very likely to allow the Black Legion Helldrake, if deployed to a planet by its lonesome, to, alone, entirely by itself, win command struggles for you, which is going to be absolutely mandatory strictly because of the incredible resource investment that this unit commands. Another possible upside is that even though this unit is fantastically expensive, it nevertheless only takes the place of a single card in your deck. And in that case, even if your opponent manages to destroy this fantastically powerful unit, they nevertheless quite likely have to invest a great many more cards than you did, simply to defeat this one adversary. So even if you and your opponent ultimately break even regarding resources invested, if they had to spend 2, 3, or 4 cards to year 1, in many ways you ultimately win in that situation. I think it certainly goes without saying that your playing this unit anywhere on the table essentially forces your opponent to respond, and though they can try to ignore this unit to the best of their ability, hopefully you're going to be either deploying this to the first planet or in any case at some sort of pivotal, decisive location that's going to make a critical difference as to the outcome of the game, strictly so you can try to force your opponent into squaring off against this enormously powerful unit. One of its traits, as I'm sure you'll note, is Elite, which makes this 8-cost unit entirely immune to the likes of the Tau Deception, and, as we'll cover time and time again throughout this video, it also possesses the Demon trait, which has the effect of allowing you to sacrifice any and all cultist tokens you generate over the course of the game in order to reduce the resource investment required to deploy this unit by a single point, making it entirely possible that, perhaps during the late game, if you happen to have a small army of cultists, you can ultimately only pay a handful of resources to get this into play, so long as you are willing to opportunistically sacrifice all of those tokens. But Unfortunately, this unit with nearly unrivaled potential has a great number of pitfalls and weaknesses that your enemy can exploit to deal with it rather handily and entirely escape having to endure round after round of dealing 1 or 2 points of damage per attack to this unit while they suffer devastating loss after devastating loss. Even though a Tau player won't be able to bounce this back to your hand, if you happen to be running up against a Dark Eldar player or any player that can ally with the Dark Eldar faction, they can either use Archon's Terror or Blackheart Ravager 2 with either a single attack or a couple resources, rout this unit, sending it packing back to your HQ to be exhausted and taken out of a combat situation immediately. And particularly if you're not the player with the initiative token, you can suffer enormously frustrating effects like the Silvered Blade Avenger if this happens to be your only or one of your only attacking units, quite likely locking this down combat round after combat round, in that it can exhaust whatever it hits each and every turn it attacks. Similarly, the Shrouded Harlequin could exhaust the Black Legion Helldrake during combat, and it goes without saying that this is an obvious target for the Eldar Warlord Eldorath Starbane, so that the instant he's commit to any planet, not only is it exhausted during that potentially critical first round of combat, but even Warlord against Warlord at that planet, you're not going to derive the benefit from those incredible, at times invaluable 3 command icons. But still worse, other factions have either simple or devious means of helping to dispatch this unit. Not only does the Space Marines player have Indomitable to entirely prevent one of these enormous 8-value attacks, but unless you're willing to be very liberal with your use of shield cards on this 8 hit point flyer, even a single point of damage taken during an attack from a Space Marines faction player piloting Captain Cato Sicarius could result in the event the Fury of Sicarius immediately destroying this enormous investment of yours, and I can only imagine how enormously frustrating it might feel to lose your Helldrake at the hands of something like an Iron Hands Tech Marine. Still yet another one of the abundant options available to Space Marines players, particularly those playing Cato, is that if you happen to deploy this card early during the deploy phase, and given its cost, you're quite likely to have to play this before too many other cards, just in case it's ultimately entirely unaffordable. If you do happen to play this on a planet, they can simply invest 3 resources in Sicarius' Chosen to move it out of the way to some adjacent planet, potentially taking it away from that decisive battle that could easily decide the outcome of the game. And considering, too, that given our current card pool, the Chaos player doesn't have any means of easily or conveniently or at all relocating a unit once it's deployed, once your Helldrake or any powerful unit of yours is shifted out of position, you're essentially out of luck for getting it back into the thick of combat. Even if you do happen to be so fortunate as to get your Black Legion Helldrake into combat and keep it there where it can absorb and deal out enormous amounts of damage, despite that immense pool of hit points and the flying keyword, it's nevertheless of paramount importance that you realize that this unit is by no means indestructible, and probably the easiest counter to this unit is simply your opponent swarming the field with low-cost, multiple army units. If they can attack with even a handful of low attack value units, round after round they're going to ultimately accumulate a very large number of damage tokens on your Helldrake that you might get outpaced by. Even though without the benefit of shield cards, the Helldrake can destroy any single unit in the game with a single attack, if your opponent has even a few means of withstanding some of those attacks, or they simply have a lot of low-value units they don't mind losing, over the course of several combat rounds, even the lowliest of attackers could easily destroy a Helldrake. Something like Snotling Attack, for instance, the 2-cost Orc event would be a fantastic answer to you deploying a Helldrake, just because by putting 4 1/1 Snotlings tokens into play, each of those is going to require an 8 attack value attack, regardless of their 1 hit point, to destroy, and unless you've got your Warlord backing up your Helldrake or any number of other units, those insignificant, tiny, weak little tokens could, over several rounds, ultimately bring down and destroy even a mighty opponent like this one, forcing you to feel enormously foolish for investing such a staggering amount of resources and/or cultist tokens. Even if you do happen to crush your opponent in a given combat situation, if it happens to be at the first planet during any subsequent Warlord committance during the command phase, it's going to show up exhausted during that first round of combat, and not only does that make it more vulnerable to the likes of something like Starbane's Council, but any units are going to be able to have a free window of attacking it prior to you being able to respond and outright annihilate any of their medium to high cost attackers. It's entirely possible that due to the enormous expense required to put this unit into play, that this is, in all likelihood, going to be your entire army during a given fight. And although at the very late game, perhaps during the final, decisive, game-deciding battle, you may have an excess of resources or cultist tokens distributed anywhere throughout the board that allows you to easily afford this, unless you can really leverage battlefield conditions against your opponent, I can't help but feel that most players are going to be enormously let down by the incredible, unrealized potential inherent to this unit. While it certainly may happen that you have the odd game now and then where you happen to win a battle at Yvonne perhaps and put this into play from your hand for free, absolutely outclassing and maybe eventually even destroying whatever unit your opponent happens to play, it just seems like putting so many eggs in one, albeit enormous basket, has such incredible potential to let you down. Beyond that staggering upfront initial investment, and even beyond giving up the potential of so many deploy actions during the deployment phase, leaving yourself so vulnerable in putting all your cards on the table and then letting your opponent have free rein as to how they'd like to respond. This card could very well be an enormous liability, just because you're not only paying all of those resources up front, but you're also potentially depriving yourself of the opportunity to do myriad other things with those. So if you don't happen to have a noteworthy command presence distributed throughout the battlefield, you're not only paying a ton of resources out, but you're also potentially missing out on the opportunity to earn a ton of those resources back, and you're not drawing nearly as many cards as your opponent. So even if you are able to score some pretty reasonable, valuable kills with this unit, you might be giving up so much more than you realize simply through the merit of your playing this. So certainly I think if you're going to include this in a deck, it's a unit you're not going to want very many copies of. It certainly does have the capability of turning the tides of any battle in your favor, but unless you wait until the very late game to deploy this unit, although I certainly won't dispute that this unit could make an enormous difference as to the outcome of the last or final few battles of a game, given the sheer number of risks that you run by playing a unit like this one, I can't help but think you're ultimately going to be fantastically disappointed by your return on investment. But now that we've rather thoroughly covered the most powerful unit in the entirety of the core set, let's move on to the 2-cost Chaos Fanatics, with 2 command icons, an attack value of 1, 2 hit points, and the Cultist trait. So, for a cost identical to our Alpha Legion Infiltrator, instead of commanding enormous amounts of attack power, this unit looks instead to command a large income of resources and cards for you. We don't have a lot of 2-cost units with 2 command icons, so for that reason alone, this could be a very valuable expenditure of resources indeed. It's hardy enough that you can deploy it to a planet by itself and be reasonably sure that your opponent isn't going to be able to easily dispatch it. So it survives a volley from Orc Cannon, it survives a ping from Sicarius's Chosen, and although in that situation its location gets shifted, it nevertheless does possess more command icons than that signature Space Marines unit. So even though you might not be winning the command struggle you were hoping for, you could nevertheless still rein in some cards and resources. This certainly is a rather plain vanilla style unit. It's rather similar to the Dark Eldar Incubus Warrior that you also have the option to run, and whether you run one of those units or both, this is certainly the more resilient of those 2 options presented to you. And beyond that, it has the Cultist trait, which exposes you to a little bit of synergy with the Ravenous Flesh Hounds that we'll cover later in the video, a reasonably hard-hitting, enormously durable unit which has the ability of healing, potentially again and again, each and every time that you're willing to sacrifice a cultist, of which the Chaos Fanatics here are probably not the optimal choice, but the flexibility inherent to having myriad options available to you is scarcely a bad or unwelcome thing. He's certainly more difficult to kill than Void Pirates or Rogue Traders, and although he is vulnerable to potentially being caught up in either your or your opponent's Warp Storm, for such a small investment of resources, it's hard to go wrong. Helping to establish an early game command lead against your opponent is fantastic. The earlier you can start building tempo and gaining advantage against your opponent, the better. So even though this unit isn't terribly exciting by itself, particularly after covering the Helldrake, it's nevertheless a Chaos staple, and if you're looking to win some command struggles, although the command phase may never be quite so glamorous as combat, if you're looking to ultimately win games, I definitely recommend starting with units like the Chaos Fanatics. Next up, we have the iconic Chaos unit, the Khorne Berserker. With a cost of 3, 1 command icon, 2 attack value, and 4 hit points, as well as the Warrior, Khorne, and World Eater traits. And last but not least, it has the Brutal keyword. So, just like we've seen with so many other units, this does happen to have 1 token command icon, so whether this is deployed to a planet by itself, or at a location where you happen to have other units, that may nevertheless make some small difference in amounting to you drawing additional cards or generating additional resources. Potentially important considering just how expensive so many of the other Chaos units we see are. But the rest of its statistics aren't too bad either. 2 attack is certainly nothing to sneeze at, and having that moderate pool of 4 hit points is not only decent, but considering that built-in printed brutal keyword, could ultimately equate to a pretty enormous increase in attack power, in addition to some pretty reasonable base fundamental survivability. There are certainly a number of problems inherent to the brutal keyword, specifically that it's very easy for your opponent to try and take advantage of or bully your brutal units, so that you don't derive nearly as much value out of that attack power boost as you otherwise could. But there nevertheless exist a few different options for you to try and get as much attack out of this Khorne Berserker as possible. If it just so happens that you trigger a warp storm at this planet, maybe you not only kill off your opponent's units or soften them up, but you also have the added benefit of increasing the attack power of your Berserker that does nevertheless survive that global damage type effect. Or, instead, if you choose to affix attachments to this unit, it's got pretty decent base statistics that only stand to get all the better. For instance, Rune-encrusted Armor that we'll cover in this video boosts this up to a 4 attack, 6 hit point unit that maintains that brutal keyword. Although at that point, it's worth considering that Possessed, the next unit we're going to cover, would cost exactly the same, yet take up only a single slot in your deck, have higher base attack power, and although it's ever so slightly squishier, it has access to the demon synergy to reduce its cost that the Khorne Berserker does not. All the same, if you're bound and determined to leverage attachments in your favor, the Orc Rocket Launcher would be fantastic on the Khorne Berserker once it potentially boosts up its attack power, just so that you can guarantee once it's already started taking some damage, you can leverage that bolstered attack power against your opponent as early as possible, preferably before he or she has any opportunity to attack you in return and kill off this boosted unit. If you do happen to be running Zerathur as your chosen warlord, this is a fine target for Infernal Gateways so that you could ambush this into play. And, seeing as how this unit has multiple traits that at the moment have yet to see any kind of development, there's certainly room for growth when it comes to not only that Khorne trait, but also this unit being member of the World Eater's Chaos Space Marine Trader Legion. So, taken all together, I think if you're interested in a moderately durable, medium survivability unit that can nevertheless attain some decent attack power, but is nevertheless quite a bit hardier than the Alpha Legion Infiltrator, the Khorne Berserker might just be the perfect unit for you. But if you are looking to push that attack power to absolutely monumental and indeed unrivaled heights, look no further than our next army unit in the 5-cost Possessed. It also has 1 command icon, but it has a whopping 9 printed attack value. It has 4 hit points and the Demon and Elite traits with no game-relevant text. So, it doesn't do much for you during the command phase, but it certainly does something. But if you're looking to play Possessed, you're probably not interested in its command presence. If you want to hit hard, this is going to be the unit for you. Although it doesn't circumvent enemy units that happen to possess the flying keyword, as the Black Legion Helldrake can, out of every unit in the core set, this has the highest and indeed unrivaled printed attack value. If you just so happen to hit your opponent first, whether you happen to have initiative or whether you're able to give this unit ranged via the Orcish Rocket Launcher, you can hit enormously hard and destroy almost any enemy unit, indeed any non-flying enemy unit, unless your opponent deploys tricks or events against you, potentially before they might be able to do anything to resist you. That pool of 4 hit points is not enormous for a 5-cost unit, but again, if you're going to be deploying this guy into the midst of combat, I'd make sure that you can leverage some sort of opportunistic advantage in your favor, just so you can make sure that he gets off at least an attack or 2 with that staggering attack value, so that you can deal out as much damage to your opponent as possible. 5 resources certainly is quite a lot to invest in one unit, but seeing as how it's got that demon trait, you can nevertheless sacrifice any number of cultists to reduce that cost, or a unit we'll be covering later, the Splintered Path Acolyte, can reduce that cost still further. As with every other faction, Chaos also happens to possess a support to decrease the resource cost by 1 of typically the first Chaos unit you play during a given turn. And in addition to that, by merit of possessing the Elite keyword, if it just so happens that you throw your possessed in a sacrificial sense into combat, killing an enemy unit only to be destroyed itself, fallback is certainly a fantastic option for dumping this back into your HQ after it's been destroyed. In that case, though, the problem is, with only 4 built-in hit points, it's not necessarily a unit you want deploying from your headquarters to a planet and arriving exhausted during the initial round of combat alongside your warlord. It's not exactly fragile, but it's definitely going to make one hell of a priority target for your enemy. It's certainly also nice that being an elite, it makes it immune to the Tau, returning it to your hand via deception, so your resource investment is a little bit more protected in that sense, but as with any other big, hard-hitting, nasty, expensive units that doesn't happen to be unique, this is entirely susceptible to the likes of Archon's Terror, so as much as you might enjoy allying with the Dark Eldar as the Chaos player, your opponent may enjoy it just as much or even more. So certainly a powerful tool in the Chaos player's arsenal. I think with ranged, this can be incredibly powerful, and this is certainly yet another means that the Chaos player may have access to that could allow them to win some of the most decisive or critical battles of a game. With such an enormously high printed attack value, unless your opponent's warlord has been very free with expending shield cards or been using Iron Halo or any number of other card effects, you're very likely to bloody them very quickly and or kill them if you do manage to force them into a combat situation. All I know is that personally, outside of the most absolute dire of circumstances, I would make absolute certain to keep my warlord far away from any planet at which there happens to be a possessed. I think something of critical importance, if you do opt to play this unit, is to be very aware of the exact nature of the kind of tricks that your opponent might be able to play on you. For instance, if it just so happens that in playing this relatively expensive unit, you have to end up passing before your opponent during that deployment phase, it's entirely possible that they might do something dirty like playing a 1-cost Viorla Marksman, and then attaching a 1-resource ion rifle to it. So even though that 4 HP is under normal circumstances adequate, if they are able to leverage some devious ranged attacker like that, at the very least you want to make sure that you're holding onto a shield card or two, or potentially are prepared with any number of different Chaos faction events, so that hopefully you can turn the tables back against your opponent. And next up, let's let loose the dogs of war with the Ravenous Hounds, a 5-cost army unit with 1 command icon, 3 attack power, 6 hit points, the Demon, Khorne, and Elite traits, and the text "No attachments as well as action." Sacrifice a cultist unit to remove all damage from this unit. So, in many ways, I think this is the opposite side of the coin to Possessed. Whereas that unit had a monumental amount of attack power and was relatively frail and fragile, the Hounds instead have a rather restrained attack value, but a very respectable pool of 6 hit points. And in addition to that, they have a repeatable sacrifice effect, whereas insofar as you're willing to give up the lives of one of your cultists anywhere on the entire game board, you can remove any and all damage from the Ravenous Hounds, with no limit per phase, no limit per round. While they certainly aren't doing too much to win a command struggle for you, they're nevertheless doing just as much as the possessed ever do. But with either of those units, if you're looking to put them into play, it's probably not going to be winning command struggles. These Ravenous Flesh Hounds are perhaps one of the absolute best units in the game, although they do need a little bit of help when it comes to winning battles through attrition alone. Certainly they aren't terribly hard-hitting, but unless your opponent has some sort of clever answer for them, like routing them or playing the Fury of Sicarius, or any number of tricky little effects, particularly considering that you can use 1, 2, or 3 value shield cards just to ensure that these guys aren't killed by a large attack, they could easily wear down a single large hard-hitting opponent or potentially kill innumerable smaller and weaker units. Again, it all comes down to how many cultists you have on the board and how many you're willing to invest. Just because many of those are either army units that in and of themselves are useful, whether they're winning you command struggles, generating extra cards and resources, or even if there's some of your cultist tokens, those can nevertheless be used effectively as resources in reducing the cost of demon units. So certainly the Fleshhounds here can be a little bit expensive. They only stand to get stronger as the Chaos faction sees more and more cultists over time. So, if you're looking for something to bog down your opponent, to tar pit and eventually wear down even their strongest units, this might end up being a decent answer. Even if your opponent has something devious like an Honored Librarian that seems entirely untargetable, so long as you have enough cultists to sacrifice, you can slowly but surely eat away each and every other enemy unit at that planet until you finally expose that Honored Librarian and then ultimately destroy him as well. So I think in a combat situation, it's going to make a hell of a lot of sense for your opponent to target some of your other units first and place much higher priority on those that can't heal, just to minimize the amount of attacks they have to incur each and every combat round. But certainly, this has the possibility of soaking up a ton of firepower. I think it's probably a very good thing for the health of the game that this unit cannot have attachments, just to make sure it doesn't spiral quickly out of control. Plus, one additional benefit is when it comes to your opponent trying to deviously rid him or herself from this unit's presence at a planet, that elite keyword makes it ever so slightly more stubborn to remove. This is an interesting unit. I'm not sure it's going to make it in a lot of decks, considering that relatively expensive cost for that fairly paltry attack value. But all the same, certainly one, as with so many others, to keep an eye on, and I'm excited to see what cultists are yet to come. But next up, we have one of Chaos's most formidable army units in the 6-cost Soul Grinder, with 2 command icons, a respectable attack value of 4, and a pretty sizable pool of 6 hit points. It has the Demon, War Engine, and Elite traits, and reads no War Gear attachments. Reaction. After you win a command struggle at this planet, your opponent must sacrifice a non-warlord unit at this planet if able. So, while the Chaos player certainly has a large number of expensive cards, they also happen to have some relatively affordable ones as well. And if it just so happens that you can save up enough resources to play a Soul Grinder late in the deployment phase, optimally after your opponent passes, or you can sacrifice any number of cultists or maybe a Splintered Path Acolyte to drop the Soul Grinder's cost down considerably, you could hatch an indescribably nasty surprise on your opponent by deploying this unit to the same planet as one of their most valuable, hard-hitting, but nevertheless vulnerable and hopefully low command icon value units. If it does just so happen that you're able to starve your opponent of actions, whether or not you're able to simply play this card much later in the deployment phase than they are, or if it just so happens that you force their hand and your opponent ultimately has to pass, leaving them entirely vulnerable to harassment like this unit and other card effects, hopefully in response to their laying out some enormously powerful, fantastically expensive, and very valuable unit out anywhere on the battlefield, the Soul Grinder in particular would make a fantastic means of punishing your opponent for making some large investment in any single unit. And under ideal conditions, they'd be deploying that unit to a planet by its lonesome. So if you can force your opponent's hand, if they don't have any convenient non-warlord unit to sacrifice, it's entirely possible that you can sneak this 2 command icon unit into play, win a command struggle at the same planet where your opponent happens to have some hard-hitting, expensive, but nevertheless low command units, ranging from something like an Ultramarines Dreadnought to maybe an Orcish Goth Knob. Though it's probably unlikely to often occur, the value you could derive from that reaction is absolutely fantastic. And although you're extraordinarily unlikely to be able to trigger that reaction 2 consecutive turns, it nevertheless is possible. I just definitely think you have to consider that this certainly has a different level of power relative to the faction and warlord that you're up against. For instance, if you just so happen to be playing against an Eldar player running Eldorath Starbane, it's absolutely trivial for them to commit their warlord to the same planet as the Soul Grinder to exhaust this unit and utterly negate both of its command icons. And unless you have an absolutely tremendous command presence at that planet, then you're very unlikely to be winning that command struggle indeed, even if your warlord does happen to be sitting there ready to contest your opponent. Plus, even if you do manage to starve your opponent of actions during the deployment phase, it's nevertheless entirely possible that you're simply unable to win command. Or, even more likely still, maybe they just have multiple low-value units at that planet. So, whether it's something like a 1-cost Bealtan Guardian that by itself matches the Soul Grinder's command icon, or something like the 0-cost Recon Drone for the Tau that does the same, there are nevertheless a very large number of answers to the Soul Grinder. Even the 0-cost Neutral Attachment Promotion, although it is limited, gives any attached unit a grand total of 2 additional command icons. So, whether or not you're actually going to manage to trigger the Soul Grinder's ability is really gonna vary wildly from game to game. But nevertheless, it does benefit from that demon cultist synergy. It is an elite, so it can't be dispatched quite so simply as being bounced back to your hand. But all the same, it is nevertheless going to be a little difficult to get the utmost value out of this unit. Under absolutely optimal conditions, depending on how you send your warlord into combat, whether or not you can use promotions of your own, or whether or not you can supplement the Soul Grinder with low-cost, high command icon value units of your own, it all kind of remains to be seen. I think that certainly the amount of benefit you'll see from the Soul Grinder's ability, if any, is going to vary tremendously from game to game. The likelihood of your being able to trigger this effect more than once, on either consecutive turns or even during the same game, I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that you're going to be able to benefit from this ability more than once. If you are playing 1 or more copies of the Soul Grinder, you're unlikely to be able to force your opponent to sacrifice a very high-value target, particularly considering units like the Land Raider and Leman Russ Battle Tank have 3 or 4 command icons respectively, but it is possible that this could pay off reasonably well, but certainly the Soul Grinder by itself, whether or not you opt to sacrifice cultists, can be fairly enormously expensive, and although its combat prowess is certainly nothing to sneeze at, and even the likes of Archon's Terror cannot affect this unit outside of the combat phase, the value inherent to that reaction is nevertheless going to vary considerably. But even if you can force your opponent to sacrifice a 1 or 2 cost unit, you are nevertheless seeing some decent value out of it. So, for its stats, considering its cost, I definitely consider whether or not you want to include this in your deck over any other comparable units rather carefully. But ultimately, as with so many other high-risk, high-reward type units, under the right circumstances, this nevertheless has the potential to pay off in spades. But now that we've covered so many consecutive, expensive elite units, one means of helping to get those into play is the 1-cost Splintered Path Acolyte, with 1 command icon, 1 attack, 1 hit point, and the Cultist and Tzeentch traits, as well as the text Interrupt. When you deploy a demon unit, sacrifice this unit to reduce its cost by 2. So you can scarcely get any lower of a resource investment than 1, and 1 resource for 1 command icon is A-okay with me. That 1 attack value is not going to be doing much for you, but alongside your warlord, it is nevertheless enough to potentially dispatch an enemy incubus warrior, rogue trader, void pirate, any number of other fragile options, even during a chaos mirror match. If it just so happens that you can get the initiative token, it's entirely possible for a weak character like this one to kill the likes of an Alpha Legion Infiltrator, provided that your opponent doesn't feel like investing a shield card. But if you're going to be playing this Acolyte, you're not choosing to do so based on its combat abilities. Specifically, you're either looking to win command struggles to generate extra resources and draw extra cards on the cheap, or you're looking to exploit this for its ability. So anytime you feel like putting one of the powerful demons we've already covered, whether it's something like a Soul Grinder, whether you need the enormous attack power of a Possessed, or you simply want to bog down and tar pit your opponent with a Ravenous Hounds, the Splintered Path Acolyte could provide one fantastic means of reducing the cost of those enormously expensive elite units. Plus, if it just so happens that you do already have a copy of those Ravenous Hounds in play, if you are wanting to preserve its life under any and all costs, this single resource army unit is just one fantastic means of refilling those Hounds' 6 pool of hit points. Clearly, any unit with 1 hit point is extraordinarily vulnerable to a host of different effects, ranging from Orc Cannon, as we've already covered, to your own Warp Storm, any form of area effect type damage, or even a single damage ping from your opponent's Sicarius' Chosen. And for a unit like this, whether or not you actually want to expend a shield card in order to save its life may or may not be a little bit questionable, but if Zerathur is your chosen warlord, this unit having the Tzeentch traits allows you to take full advantage of recursive effects like the Shrine of Warp Flame to return it to play, so that potentially you can benefit from that sacrifice ability time and time again. So, for its cost, for its command presence, and for its potential resource savings, I think it's very hard to go wrong with an affordable unit like the Splintered Path Acolyte. But moving right along, next we have yet another cultist in the 3-cost Umbral Preacher, with 2 command icons, 1 attack value, and 4 hit points. It is a cultist and priest, and reads each army unit at this planet cannot retreat from battle. So this unit serves very much as a double-edged sword, in that unless you're using some sort of sneaky means of opportunistically surprising your opponent by dropping this guy into play, namely Zarathar's signature event, Infernal Gateway, its ability affects every army unit at its planet, not strictly your opponent. And although it does have a pretty fantastic command presence, it is nevertheless rather expensive at 3. And even though you're hoping to generate an interdiction field of sorts and pin your opponent's units down to 1 planet, so soon as they manage to scrape together either the 4 attack value required to kill this unit, or they rout it, or use any number of other effects to kick this guy out of play or off the planet, as soon as he's gone, they're entirely able to escape from you. So, even if you were looking to force your opponent to sit at a planet and suffer turn after turn of attacks from some horrific attacker of yours, ranging from a Black Legion Helldrake or Possessed or whatever it happens to be, this Preacher, although interesting in theory, nevertheless seems to be a relatively fragile means of attempting to keep your opponent where you'd like them. And, as I already suggested, if your opponent's able to spring some sort of devious trap against you, perhaps ambushing some units of their own in play, if they're absolutely adamant in refusing to attack your Preacher, they could very well lock your units down at that planet until they kill off all of your expensive, vulnerable, valuable attacking units before finally turning their sights on your Preacher. And unless you're able to sacrifice the unit through a Ravenous Hounds on the table or some sort of other means, having your ability to retreat compromised just in the case your opponent does leverage some sort of devious trick against you could ultimately backfire in a big way. And for the sheer number of resources that you're investing in this unit, personally, I think I'd be much more likely to save up and invest those resources in a unit that can hopefully do as much damage to my opponent before they retreat as possible, as opposed to attempting to prevent them from doing so entirely. So, even though it does have a respectable amount of command icons, I'm nevertheless much more likely to look toward other, cheaper, similarly powerful options when it comes to winning command struggles, and insofar as combat, the Preacher here unfortunately just does not strike me as someone that I want to be fighting alongside. But in any case, up next we have what's sure to be a great many different people's absolute favorite army unit in the 5-cost Vicious Bloodletter. It has a loyal icon, no command icons, a 4 attack value, 4 hit points, the Demon, Khorne, and Elite traits, and the restriction no war gear attachments. But oh so importantly, it has the ability Area Effect 3. So, for a relatively steep initial investment, this unit, perhaps more so than any other in the game, has the ability to potentially decimate a literal innumerable number of enemy units, so long as you manage to trigger that area effect volley. If it just so happens that you're running Zarathar at the same planet as a Vicious Bloodletter, any enemy unit oh so unfortunate as to suffer that area card effect will be assigned an enormous and staggering 4 points of damage, which is enough to kill cheap units, moderately expensive units, and even some of the most expensive units we've yet seen in the game. Even your own 5-cost Possessed on the opponent's side of the table would require a shield card not to be killed outright target by this effect. And considering that it's not just targeting one opponent, that it's attacking any number of enemies at that location, is absolutely absurd in just how powerful that can be. Remember that area effect counts as a card effect, not an attack. So even any enemy units that happen to have the flying keyword take no reduced damage whatsoever from this devastating effect. Even if you only manage to get off a single area volley with your Bloodletter, that could nevertheless sweep the most decisive, critical, deciding battle of the game entirely in your favor, and absolutely devastate the ranks of your opponent's army. Plus, if it just so happens that you can supplement this attack with any number of other card effects, the damage that you could do to your entire opponent's army is just insane. Just think, for instance, if you obliterate 90% of your opponent's armed forces, even if your opponent uses some devious means of preserving one of their most valuable units, or simply any unit capable of killing your Bloodletter in return. Maybe they decided to expend a 2 or 3 value shield card, or use any number of different card effects. It's entirely possible that you might follow up this attack by triggering an ability like Tzeentch's Firestorm or some such effect to do that small extra amount of damage required to destroy and dispatch that enemy unit prior to your opponent having any opportunity to attack you back. As with so many other demons, this vicious Bloodletter happens to have that elite trait, so the Tau can't simply bounce it back to your hand, and if you've got the initiative token in particular, unless your opponent's able to use some sort of clever routing effect or other means of circumventing this ability entirely, the amount of suffering, anguish, damage, and grief that you could inflict upon your opponent in a single combat turn is nearly unrivaled. And even though in many cases Area Effect 3 is going to be absolute overkill, for instance if all you need to destroy are Chimera tokens or some similarly fragile enemy attacker, the fact that you can front load so much damage in a single action, as opposed to having, say, 3 copies of Acolyte Strike Force, trigger that card effect combat turn after combat turn after combat turn, it's just ridiculous. So, Vicious Bloodletter, although like I mentioned, a relatively steep investment that could potentially let you down, nevertheless has more potential upside than almost any other unit I can think of. So for all of those reasons and more, not only is this probably one of the most exciting units in the game, but it's also quite likely to be one of the most deadly and dangerous. But regardless as to whether or not you can ultimately derive the utmost effect from that area effect, be sure that as soon as this unit hits the table, your opponent is going to be paying rapt attention, and so long as it remains in play, under almost any circumstance, this Vicious Bloodletter is going to be the priority target for your opponent. Really, the last thing I can think of to mention about the Bloodletter is that you probably want to put off or entirely prevent, as much as possible, this army unit from ever joining your warlord's retinue, just because as soon as he's being commit to planets alongside your warlord and arriving from your headquarters, exhausted and unusable during that initial round of combat, he's going to be extraordinarily exposed and extraordinarily vulnerable, and almost any opponent would go to indescribable lengths to make sure that this guy is ultimately destroyed before you get any opportunity to trigger that potentially obliterating and game-deciding effect. Although it's entirely possible that a clever opponent might dash your greatest hopes and dreams when it comes to this unit, such as the likes of an Eldrath Starbane being commit turn after turn to ensure that this Bloodletter is exhausted, under the right circumstances, managing to get off this ability even a single time could single-handedly swing the tide of a game dramatically in your favor. But in any case, next up we have yet another unit with enormous potential, but one that may perhaps be ever so slightly less likely to be realized. In the 4-cost Virulent Plague Squad, with 1 command icon, a 1 base printed attack value, 4 hit points, the Warrior, Nurgle, and Death Guard traits, and the text, "This unit gets +1 attack for each unit in your opponent's discard pile." So, just like I mentioned, in the right circumstance, provided that your opponent's discard pile is absolutely full of discarded and destroyed units, this could very well interplay with an absolutely enormous attack value. And considering too that Chaos players are very free to ally with Orcs, if you just so manage to get this unit's attack value bolstered up toward the heavens, and then attach a rocket launcher to it in order to give it ranged, you could potentially devastate your opponent by getting off some enormously powerful ranged attacks before your opponent has any opportunity to either respond in kind or maybe retreat with their warlord. But the problem with this unit is that its value is going to vary tremendously from game to game, and even from round to round, in that if your opponent doesn't have many units in their discard pile, this isn't going to be doing much, and if your opponent has recursive effects where they can return units from their discard pile to their hand or to play, then the Virulent Plague Squad's attack is going to be all the lower for it. It does happen to have a token command icon, but it's not doing too much for you in the command phase, and considering that relatively enormous cost relative to other units, you're certainly not going to be looking to put this into play strictly to benefit from some sort of economic advantage against your opponent. All the same, this unit is relatively hardy, but I just cannot get over how incredibly inconsistent that attack value is going to be. In the early game, if you happen to maybe start the game with this card in your hand, it's going to essentially be dead as a 4-cost, 1 attack value unit. And if that just so happens to be the case, it could be easily ignored, or during a prolonged combat situation where your opponent does anticipate losing units, they can attack in an order which guarantees that you'll be able to get as little benefit from this ability as possible. So, although it could potentially, maybe under ideal circumstances, sponge up an attack or two for some of your more normally valuable units, if your opponent kills this off before they incur a large number of losses, then you're looking at a lot of wasted resources. At the moment, it doesn't have any useful trait synergy, and for 1 fewer resource than Possessed or the Ravenous Flesh Hounds, this just strikes me as such an enormously expensive unit. It's entirely possible that in the very late game your opponent might have 8 or more units in their discard pile, but you're looking at a hell of a long game and a hell of a lot of dead enemy units, or discarded cards, before this even approaches the heights of attack that a Possessed has printed on its card. And even though this is 1 less resource to put into play, by merit of not being a demon, you're not going to be able to potentially benefit from sacrificing any number of those cultist tokens you might generate in order to further lower this unit's cost. Important, too, to consider is that there's very much a finite number of game rounds, and if you're only playing a 3, 4, even 5 planet game, if it's not stretching into some epic match of Conquest, then the number of units in your opponent's discard pile could be very low indeed. So, although in some situations, perhaps where you're running up against the Tau, and they're playing army units as attachments affixed to other units you might get the chance to destroy, if there's not a lot in your opponent's discard pile, the Plague Squad here is not going to be doing much for you. And as with almost any competitive card game, deck consistency is one of the keys and fundamentals of winning. So, while the Plague Squad might be interesting, it might be fun, on occasion it might be used to devastating effect against your enemy, I think those occurrences are going to be enormously few and far between, and for that reason, given the present development of our card pool, I just cannot recommend these Death Guard. But on to the last of our Chaos Army units, the unique Zave Split-tongue, with a cost of 3, 2 command icons, a loyal icon, an attack value of 2, 3 hit points, and the Warrior and Slaanesh traits, as well as reaction. After an enemy unit at this planet is destroyed, put a cultist token into play at your HQ. So, although he is unique, and therefore you want to be very careful in considering just how many copies of him you include in your deck, that ability could nevertheless provide an enormous resource advantage in your favor, in that each and every one of those cultist tokens can be sacrificed at will in order to reduce the resource investment required by so many of your oh-so-powerful demon units. Whether it's something like the Soul Grinder, where you're hoping to trick your opponent into having to sacrifice one of their more expensive units, or whether it's something like the Vicious Bloodletter, which very well gives you the possibility of leveling your opponent's entire army. There are any number of eligible targets for those tokens, and as we see more and more expansions and upcoming releases, there stand to only be still more in time. Plus, for the cost of 3, it's hard to go wrong with 2 command icons, but beyond that, he's also hitting reasonably hard, and is relatively survivable to boot. His ability is probably at its absolute utmost effect when played as part of a Zerathir deck, in that you can trigger the Infernal Gateway event to surprise your opponent by putting him into play at the right moment immediately prior to your killing any number of enemy units, so that you can generate as many cultists as possible. Very important to note is that his reaction keys off of enemy units being destroyed, not simply destroyed via attacks. And given that 3 hit points, it's entirely possible that you could deploy him, trigger a Warp Storm to kill off enemy units, trigger a Tzeentch's Firestorm to kill off any units, or perhaps in the absolute ideal situation, maybe you surprise your opponent by dropping him into play, and then you kill off any number of weak or token units your opponent happens to control with something like an enormous Vicious Bloodletter area effect volley. Certainly this unit has enormous potential. He's probably going to, as a result, be a priority target for your opponent, but if they have to pick between some of your hard-hitting elites and this character, they may ultimately decide that the lesser of two evils is letting you generate some of these tokens. And if you do just so happen to be piloting Zerathir as your chosen warlord, remember that that warlord unit benefits the most the more attacks and sources of damage you can have resolving at his location. So even though those cultists arrive at planets alongside him exhausted, each and every attack they do manage to land, if any, you do ultimately get to assign 2 points of damage to your opponent, despite their paltry printed 1 attack value. Certainly, one of the obvious drawbacks of Zave's is that he has to be at the planet where those units are destroyed, and that they are ultimately generated in your HQ, but in that circumstance, in that moment, they're safe from enemy attacks. If you happen to have a Ravenous Hounds at his location, that's all the more food for them that he's generating just to ensure that they stay on the battlefield for as long as possible, or as long as convenient for you. And oh so important to keep in mind is that for his ability to proc, for that effect to go off, he does not need to be ready, and that there is no limit to the number of times per phase or round that it can generate. So, as cultists in and of themselves are very much a resource meant to be spent by the Chaos player, He's certainly got the potential to be fantastic, and even if there comes a time when we're not seeing demon-heavy chaos decks, I nevertheless can't see a player going too wrong by including at least a couple copies of this unique army unit. Well, now that we've covered our legion of Chaos faction army units, on to a duo of attachments, the first of which is Dire Mutation. With a cost of 1 shield icon, the Curse and Tzeentch traits, as well as the Ambush keyword. It reads, attached to an army unit and Forced Interrupt. When attached unit exhausts, deal it 1 damage. So, for a very low resource investment and the flexibility inherent to any 1 shield icon card, this is a fantastic means of opportunistically dropping some sort of nasty surprise on your opponent, in that this attachment can be played as an action during the combat phase. So important to keep in mind is that as soon as a unit is declared an attacker is when it exhausts, and that this occurs prior to any damage assignment, shield opportunity, or ultimate resolution. So, if it just so happens that your opponent is preparing to attack you, you can make sure to affix this to that unit before it manages to have the opportunity. And if it just so happens that it only has a single hit point remaining, this attachment means that it's ultimately going to die as soon as it exhausts, so long as your opponent does not use a shield card. Plus, this has the obvious added benefit that if Zerathur is your chosen warlord, if he happens to be present at that planet, the unit is ultimately going to be assigned 2 damage upon it exhausting. And even something like an Honored Librarian, although it cannot be targeted by attacks, is entirely eligible for this kind of attachment. And whether you kill it outright as it's in the process of attempting to attack you, or whether you trigger some sort of effect like Archon's Terror that sends it packing and then subsequently exhausts it, this is a fantastic means to start stacking up damage on your opponent's most critical units. And really, for whatever unit that you affix this to, it's essentially a ticking time bomb that turn after turn, exhaustion after exhaustion, is ultimately going to wear down whatever enemy unit upon which this happens to be affixed. Also important to consider is that if you either rout an opponent's unit or you simply force it to retreat to their headquarters, if a unit is committed to a planet alongside its warlord, it arrives exhausted, in which case it would incur 1 point of damage through this forced interrupt. But if it just so happens to be committed to a planet where you have Zerathur, it exhausts upon arrival to that planet. So yet again, in that situation, it would incur 2 total assigned points of damage. And unless your opponent is intending to be very liberal with shield cards, you could make that army unit a very low priority target so that each and every combat round it keeps incurring instances of damage until it is ultimately killed, which could also serve the benefit of not only dispatching an enemy, but doing so for a very low cost, and all the while saving you from having to use the action of one of your likely expensive and valuable attacking army units. This is yet another Tzeentch card that Zerathur might be able to recur to your hand via the likes of Shrine of Warpflame, and although this does make any attached enemy army unit entirely immune to your Warp Storm, it nevertheless does confer a very nasty gift to your opponent. And considering that this doesn't only affect the enemy, if you're willing to be a little risky, it's entirely possible that you could affix this to a Khorne Berserker of your own, just to make sure that it accrues as much damage as possible, or does so in an opportunistic sense, which may ultimately end up making all the difference between your killing a number of enemy units or their ultimately surviving. So, although that kind of risky play is much less likely to take place, it's nevertheless always worth considering all your options, and in a great many different situations, Dire Mutation could provide a fantastic, affordable means of killing off some of your opponent's most valuable non-token, non-warlord units. Next up for the Chaos player, we have a much more conventional attachment in the 2-cost Rune-encrusted Armor, with 1 shield icon, the war gear and armor traits, and the text attached to an army unit, attached unit gets +2 attack and +2 HP. So, it's certainly a little bit more expensive than Dire Mutation, coming in at 2, and the primary drawback to this card is that it counts as war gear, and seeing as just how many of the Chaos units we've seen so far happen to be demons that can't affix war gear attachments, that ultimately makes them ineligible for the receipt of this attachment. But that's not to say that the Chaos player still can't derive some significant benefit from this card. Even though it bolsters attack and hit points, possibly the best use for this card is giving it to something like the Sybarite Marksman or Baleful Mandrake, 2 Dark Eldar ranged units that any Chaos player is freely eligible to ally with. The problem, however, starts to arise when you consider just how many resources you're potentially investing in one unit. And is the case with ranged attackers, you're typically not looking to benefit from hit points nearly so much as you are attack, just because under most circumstances, the higher attack value you can front load and deal unto your enemy, the better off you're going to be. So long as you can kill your enemy's unit outright, it doesn't really matter how many hit points you have if you're not suffering attack damage in return. But even with ranged characters, having that marginal HP boost certainly can't hurt. Again, not only does this make them immune to the likes of your own or your opponent's Warp Storm, but it also helps prevent something like the 1 hit point Sybarite Marksman from being sniped by an opponent's Orc Cannon, Sicarius' Chosen, Tzeentch's Firestorm, or any number of other effects. And by providing that marginal HP boost, although it's not tremendous, it can nevertheless save you from having to spend shield cards that may otherwise be better spent protecting some of your more expensive and valuable units. But nevertheless, as with any attachment, it's possible that you may not reap much benefit from this. It doesn't necessarily provide the same flexibility and inherent versatility that something like a 2-cost attacking, defending, command icon possessing unit might have. But there nevertheless do exist a host of different situations where this could be pretty useful. You could attach it to a unique character like Zave Split-tongue to make him all the hardier, all the more durable and resilient to ensure that you can generate more resource tokens. So in some ways that may allow this attachment to inadvertently pay for itself, or you might simply decide to attach this to a Khorne Berserker if you're really looking to get the utmost out of that brutal keyword. But then, in that circumstance, although you are benefiting from that boosted HP pool, at a certain point, increased attack power really starts to provide a bit of a diminishing return. So, all in all, certainly an attachment worth considering, not necessarily a 3-copy card, but depending on just how you're building a deck, perhaps you're allying with orcs and leveraging rocket launchers attached to your possessed or any other units, that might make them all the more durable, it might make them all the more hard-hitting. Again, you just want to be oh so careful in knowing exactly what to expect out of your opponent, just because it would be incredibly tragic to have one or more attachments affixed to one potentially already expensive unit, only to have it trivially exhausted by Eldorath Starbane, and then having it proceed to be obliterated by one or more copies of Starbane's Council, or any number of other effects. And now that we've covered our attachments, up next we have a duo of supports. The first of which is the unique Fortress of Madness, with a cost of 1, the location trait, the limited restriction, and as we've seen with so many other factions, interrupt. When you deploy a Chaos unit, exhaust this support to reduce that unit's cost by 1. So, at this point it should go without saying, but that limited restriction is certainly something to keep an eye on, whether or not you're running other limited cards like Promotion. As our card pool always continues to grow, that's potentially going to be more and more limiting and restrictive, crippling and potentially debilitating over time when it comes to your deck construction. Also important to note is that this only benefits Chaos units, not their Orc or Dark Eldar allies, whichever you happen to choose, and that this support has to be exhausted in order to benefit from that resource reduction. Certainly it's nevertheless powerful. The earlier you can get one copy of this into play, the better, and that you can trigger that over as many rounds as possible, and considering that games of Conquest are always very finite in length, the earlier you get this into play, the better, although you definitely also have to balance that with just how many copies of this unique support you include in your deck. Given the relative expense of Chaos units, it is quite likely that you'll benefit tremendously from any source of resource reduction, and given that you can combine this with sacrificing cultists, it's entirely possible that you can get some units onto the battlefield for an enormously low, incredibly affordable value, and potentially take your opponent entirely by surprise, if they're not on point with their on-the-fly deployment math. Certainly, it's hard to go wrong with the initial investment of a single resource token, so this certainly strikes me as a Chaos staple for at least some time to come, and I would wholeheartedly recommend at least one copy, potentially more, in any and all primarily Chaos decks. Next, our second and final support is the zero-cost Murder Cogitator, with the upgrade trait and reaction. After a cultist or demon unit you control leaves play, exhaust this support to reveal the top card of your deck. If that card is a Chaos unit, add it to your hand. So, in assessing this support, it goes without saying that something you can play for free is almost always good, although as we've seen in the past, certainly some of those cards like the Penal Legionnaire or Sniveling Grot could potentially prove to be insignificant as to the total outcome of a game. But, in this case, once one of your cultists or demons leaves play, you've got the opportunity, once per copy of Murder Cogitator, to reveal the top card of your deck and potentially to add a Chaos unit to your hand. Very important to note is that each of these supports has to exhaust in order to trigger that ability, and it only happens when a cultist or demon leaves play. But the Chaos faction does have the inherent ability of often being able to choose exactly when those cultists do leave play, often by their being sacrificed to reduce the cost to put a demon into play, so certainly in that case that makes this a relatively reliable support. The problem with this card is that the fewer Chaos units you have in your deck, the more of your deck is taken up by allied units, events, supports, or attachments, the less likely you're actually going to be able to add a card to your hand. And of course, it goes without saying that since you're revealing that card, whatever it happens to be, whether you're adding it to your hand or not, your opponent is going to be fully aware of the identity of the next card that you're going to add to your hand. As with any zero-cost card, it's very important to nevertheless consider that it's not exactly free, despite costing no resources, in that it does potentially take up one or more slots in your 50-card deck. And although this is a potentially powerful, repeatable card draw engine, also oh so important to consider is that just like with our resource-reducing support, the earlier you get this into play, the better, and the later you ultimately draw your Cogitator, the less it's ultimately going to do for you. Whether or not it manages to consistently draw you cards is going to depend entirely upon your deck composition. So when considering this support for deck inclusion, I think it's going to be of the utmost importance that when it comes to Chaos units, you very much do some card counting and percentile analysis. Last but not least, I think it's very important to mention that multiple copies of the Cogitator can all trigger off of the same event, but they do nevertheless all exhaust, and unless at some point we see some means of readying supports again, this does have that built-in once per round limitation. So, while it's certainly possible that this card could whiff and provide no effect whatsoever, apart from making your opponent all the more privy to what's on top of your deck, it's certainly worth considering that you too will know what's coming up next, so that not only your opponent, but also you can plan for that inevitable draw to the best of your ability. And certainly, if there ever comes a time when we can stack the top of our deck, this could potentially be an immensely fantastic support. So, at the moment, it's entirely up to you as to whether or not you include one or more copies. Certainly as decks run very unit heavy, I could see this being a likely inclusion. Card draw is scarcely an unwelcome thing, and even though this could very well provide some untimely information to your opponent, I nevertheless see a lot of potential upside. So for those reasons and more, I'd certainly love to hear from your personal experiences, but at the moment, particularly considering that unbeatable cost, the Murder Cogitator, at least upon initial assessment, appears to be a pretty agreeable support. But now that we've covered our supports, on to yet another zero-cost card in the Promise of Glory, an event with one shield icon, the tactic trait, and deploy action. Put 2 cultist tokens into play at your HQ. So, not only is this free, but it's essentially better than free, in that it not only has the versatility and flexibility of protecting your forces in a pinch by providing one shield icon, if it just so happens that this would make the difference between the life and death of one of your valuable units, but additionally you get to put 2 1/1 cultists into play at your headquarters, and whether you ultimately decide to commit them to a planet alongside your warlord, if it's Zerathir, potentially they hit for 2 apiece, you also have the option of sacrificing them at any time in order to reduce the cost of any demon you're looking to play by either 1 or 2, depending on how many of those tokens you're willing to part with. So, beyond being free units, beyond being essentially free resources, this also counts as one of those oh-so-valuable actions during your deployment, and it's cards like this that could potentially make all the difference between your opponent going entirely unharassed and unmolested, or you're playing a soul grinder with an attached promotion that ultimately results in their sacrificing some of their most powerful, expensive, and valuable units. So, certainly this event may not seem like it does much, but for a cost of 0, it can nevertheless confer upon you a pretty significant boost to your economy. It saves you resources, it gives you extra attackers in a pinch, and although those cultists arrive alongside your warlord exhausted, they nevertheless could dish out some reasonable damage, they could potentially sponge up some enemy attacks for you, and really the options seem nearly limitless as to what you can do with this seemingly subtle event. Really, the only problem here is that those tokens are extraordinarily vulnerable to the likes of an opponent playing a copy of Doom. Although if nothing else is getting caught in the crossfire, then consider yourself very lucky that your opponent has wasted so many resources just to remove so little. So, with no initial investment whatsoever, apart from drawing a card off the top of your deck, this event is almost all upside. And considering, too, that each and every copy of Colosseum Fighters that you play allows you the potential to return this event to your hand, the number of resources you might be able to save, or the amount of damage you might be able to inflict with this one free event is absolutely staggering. It's akin to drawing a card that allows you to gain 2 resources for free, but even better than that, there's so much versatility and flexibility as to exactly what you can do with this card. So, even though it may not seem like much upon first glance, this is nevertheless an absolutely fantastic Chaos event that I can scarcely recommend enough. But up next, we have our penultimate event in Tzeentch's Firestorm, with a cost of X, 2 shield icons, a loyal icon, the power and Tzeentch traits, and the text action. Deal X damage to a target non-warlord unit. So, apart from it being a fantastic source of shield icons, this exceptionally powerful event allows you to dictate and determine exactly how much damage you're wanting to deal to any target token or army unit, provided that you've accumulated enough resource tokens to back this up. And for that reason, it might be worth sacrificing some of your cultists, just so that later in the round you can ensure you have an abundance of ready resource tokens to expend upon an event like this Firestorm. So, seeing as how you get to determine exactly how much you're spending on this, you can use it to kill weak units, or, if you're willing to invest all the more tokens, you can also use this to kill strong units as well. And, given how the HP values are assigned to some units in this game, simply by the merit of your paying an equal number of resources to their remaining hit points, that alone might be able to let you pull ahead relative to your opponent regarding strictly the number of invested resources. Perhaps the biggest downfall to this card is that regardless as to how many resources you spend, unless you're willing to pay far more than your opponent has remaining hit points, it's entirely possible that your opponent can choose to spend shield cards in order to save one of their units from their inevitable doom at the hands of a fiery action like that associated with this event. So certainly, while there are myriad different situations where you can use this to not just break even, but pull ahead of your opponent, particularly considering that you can use this during any phase of the game, hopefully with the intent of leveraging some sort of condition in your favor, whether it's setting up to win a command struggle or simply to decimate some hard-hitting opponent on the battlefield of any given planet. This also serves as a fantastic reaction of sorts in response to some of your opponent's actions. For instance, if they trigger the action of a Catachan outpost to bolster the next attack of one of their units, you could react by using your turn to take an action by deploying this card and outright obliterating their unit before it gets any opportunity to attack you. Even though you might be investing a significant amount of resources in this card, it nevertheless could also serve the dual ability of not just destroying your opponent's units, but also serving to deny them card draw and resource accumulation simply by the merit of removing some of their potentially expensive command icon heavy units from planets where your opponent's running uncontested and fully expecting to benefit from winning those struggles. In many ways, this works similar to ambushing a unit into play, in that you can very much use this to surprise your opponent, perhaps when they're least expecting it, and without too much worry about getting hit in return, you can potentially deal a significant amount of damage without your opponent having much, if any, opportunity to respond until the following round of combat. However, events obviously differ from units in that if it just so happens that this deals the killing blow, unlike something like an eager recruit or any unit that you happen to put in play via Infernal Gateway, you're not going to ultimately be left with a unit sitting on the planet to potentially win you subsequent command struggles or contest your opponent in possible future combats. If it just so happens that you have an enormous abundance of resources, there are a few different tricks that you can use, such as if you happen to put a Soul Grinder into play on a planet, if your opponent dumps some weak but command icon heavy units onto the board, you could very well use this event to snipe those off and ultimately trigger the reaction of your elite demon unit. I would imagine it goes without saying, but another fantastic effect of this event is simply how well it synergizes with other sources of direct damage. So if you've managed to maybe splash a point of damage here and there from a Burn-a-Boys, or maybe in a previous round you've triggered a Warp Storm and softened your enemy's units, then, in saving all the more resources, that makes this card all the more affordable, or you can invest all the more up front just to guarantee that a 1, 2, or 3 value shield card doesn't prevent your opponent from essentially negating the deleterious effects of this event. Certainly, there are a great number of situations where other events could serve to be all the more powerful than this Firestorm. For instance, if you're allied with orcs and you have one big, beefy enemy unit that you're interested in killing, so long as you can force a combat at that planet, something like the 2-cost Snotling attack that puts 4 1/1 tokens into play could ultimately deal far more damage for far fewer resources, but certainly if you need pinpoint annihilation of a target enemy unit on demand, it's very hard to beat an event like this one, particularly if you're looking to kill a devious, deadly opponent like an Honored Librarian that under normal circumstances is exceptionally difficult to pin down and destroy. While any number of attacking units on your side of the battlefield might struggle to ultimately overcome that Psyker, by simply opting to play this event in advance, it could be of essentially trivial difficulty to pick off that enemy unit. And plus, seeing as how direct damage is not cut in half by the flying keyword, this is a fantastic means of responding to your opponent deploying something like the, under most circumstances, rather durable Assault Valkyrie. So, at the very least, with 2 shield icons, this event has enormous defensive value, but used for its conventional offensive effect, given the inherent versatility and flexibility in being able to pick whatever unit, wherever it is, and being able to deal however much damage you'd like to it, can certainly serve as a fantastic means of complementing and supplementing all of your other actions that turn, and potentially set you up to be in a very favorable position for the rest of the round and the rest of the game. And plus, beyond all the other utility we've already covered, just like our aforementioned dire mutation, this could serve as yet another excellent means of countering your opponent's ambushing you with units during the combat phase prior to their having any opportunity to actually attack. And last but not least, we have the last of our Chaos Faction cards and the final of our trio of Chaos Faction events. In the 3-cost Warp Storm, with 1 shield icon, the power trait, and combat action, deal 2 damage to each unit without any attachments at a target planet or HQ. So, for a rather steep initial investment, this nevertheless allows you the ability to potentially annihilate any number of units that happen to be sitting at one planet or, normally, your opponent's HQ. Although it's entirely possible that some of your own units might get caught up in the crossfire or destroyed as collateral damage, it's very important to nevertheless consider that if you just so happen to be using hardy units, or particularly units that benefit from taking damage, whether it's the likes of something relatively inoffensive to your opponent, such as Bad Dog, or any number of brutal units, such as the Khorne Berserker, that as soon as they take damage, serve to hit one hell of a lot harder, despite having the potential of harming you, the fact that you can pinpoint exactly where you'd like this event to resolve could nevertheless mean that you could deal a devastating blow to your opponent. The fact that you play this during the combat phase means you already know everything that your opponent has decided to do during deployment and the command phase. And unless they're an Eldar player that happens to be able to leverage Nullify against you, it's entirely possible that if they have a host of units sitting at a planet, either damaged or simply frail to start off with, you could very well destroy a large, or in any case, significant number of units. Or, if you've got ranged attackers or initiative is in your favor, you could use this to sufficiently soften up a number of critical enemy units so that your army can ultimately finish the job. And if you're running a large number of attachments, then whichever of your units happen to be sitting at that planet are in that case entirely impervious to this effect. But in that case, it's entirely worth considering that your opponent can derive that same benefit in that any of their units with affixed attachments are also going to be entirely immune to this event. I think it's very important to consider that this affects warlords, both yours and your opponent's, and of course, if you happen to have Zerathur at the planet, this is yet another opportunity for you to assign an additional point of damage to each and every only enemy unit upon which this effect resolves. Whether or not you're opting to run that warlord, and whether or not he happens to be present at the planet you pick, this can nevertheless give you the opportunity of removing any number of enemy units from a planet. It can set you up for the next turn in that your opponent is far less likely to win command struggles, and simply by the merit of you wiping out enemy armed forces and then replacing them with some of your own, you could potentially net all the more cards and resources for yourself, shifting economic advantage ever in your favor, and in that way this could be fantastic despite that initial cost to give yourself a significant economic advantage. Plus, if it just so happens that your opponent's headquarters is loaded up with units, if you've managed to surprise him or her with some sort of devious tricks resulting in them retreating from a critical or devastating combat, this could be a fantastic follow-up in hammering them even harder and hitting them when they're potentially most susceptible to a global damaging type effect like this one. And plus, if you happen to be targeting your enemy's HQ, you can certainly rest assured that none of your units are going to be lost in the crossfire. So, certainly that cost is nothing to scoff at. This may not be quite as powerful as a card that outright destroys units like Doom or Exterminatus, but despite being ever so slightly weaker, it's nevertheless all the more versatile, and the fact that you can pinpoint specifically which planet at which you'd like this to resolve, whether it's the first, second, third, whatever it happens to be, It's incredibly flexible, it's incredibly versatile, and gives a clever Chaos player all the more options to opportunistically dominate and destroy their opponent. And, last but not least, considering that you may, at some point, perhaps in the very late game, have an enormous surplus of resources, if the game's already been going in your favor, one or more copies of Warpstorm played against your opponent's hardiest, or most vulnerable, or most expensive units and or warlord can be absolutely devastating and be incredibly effective in your ultimately nailing down a victory. But now that we've covered the last of our Chaos faction events, that brings this video to a close. So, as always, thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. Be sure to leave a comment letting me know which of these cards is your personal favorite, and which of you had the best and worst game experiences actually playing. I always love to hear from players, both veteran and novice alike, and engaging with you viewers is the best part of running this channel. So, yet again, I'll just say thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you again soon.